Hi, this is a presentation that's on the genocide of Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent in 1937, along with a brief history of the island. I term this Hate at Play, and my name is Claude Bernard. So the following presentation will help put on display the adverse impact of hate. This is not a presentation that seeks to blame current citizens for past injustices. Names of countries and people may be cited in reference to the specific actions or events or injustices that they had either directly or indirectly participated in. When hate finds a fertile ground to feed on, it can cause catastrophic harms to innocent people and permeate the hearts of law abiding citizens to carry out horrendous activities. We have, as citizens, the obligation to stand against all forms of injustice that intend to deprive people of their dignity, existence, and sovereignty. You shall, you shall always voice your disenchantment vis-a-vis any form of injustice, whichever pigment or color that may serve to validate its application. Now, followed will be a brief overview before arriving at the genocide of 1937. We'll take a look at what happened before the massacre. You will see in this here, these are the three ships that Christopher Columbus embarked on. The one in the middle is what was understood to be Santa Maria, and we can tell because that was the largest of the three ships. In total, in all of those three ships, there were about a total of 86 citizens from Spain that embarked on that trip. And here is um, Christopher Columbus. At least this is the image we have of him up to now. What we know about Christopher Columbus' trip is that he ended up in the Caribbean in 1492, and his trip was financed by well-known investors at the time. And we must note in that process as well that he made a few attempts to have the the government of Italy and those of Portugal to see if they would be able to finance his trip. And then he finally had in he finally had the Spaniards to finance his trip. But before then, he had spent about 10 years with the Portuguese. This is why he's married to a Portuguese person um, whose name is, for the purpose of this, might be a little bit irrelevant at this point. But at the time, reaching India in the East was one of the fascination that the Europeans had in the 15th century. In their thirst for overseas and territory expansion. Now, it must also be known that at the time that they were seeking a way through the East, it was simply because the path that would be a little bit easier for them was occupied through the Mediterranean by the Moors, the ones whom they call the Moors that occupied Spain for about 700 years, and then finally in 1492 they were able to get rid of them. Now, so they could not travel through any other path but taking the western uh, um, path in order for them to see if they'd be able to reach India. So he himself did not have quite a good notion about the geographical position in which way he was in comparison to where India was. Although at that time there was good understanding as to how they could actually reach it. So once he reached some of the lands that he encountered on his way, he renamed many of those towns and inhabitants, and some of them were, well, not some of them, pretty much all of them were renamed on religious grounds and based upon his positions that he thought that he had reached India or the eastern part of the globe. So then he called those inhabitants Indians as a result of that, and he renamed many of those towns, as we shall see soon. Many of those towns based on religious beliefs at the time. Now, be aware that it's not our fault because a lot of us had received education that came from um, the western part of the world where they had to glorify many of the harms that they had imposed on us. So if you are from a country that had been at some point colonized, or you are an individual from a population that had been enslaved, you are more likely to think that in fact those inhabitants whom we call the natives were indeed Indians. And he himself thought so too, and they weren't. Now, as you shall see, I believe I already showed you those ships before, but this is just to give you an idea when they were somewhat in peril as they were approaching land in the Bahamas. Now, I believe I also mentioned that Santa Maria, the largest of the three ships, it was in peril. So the natives that were nearby remarked that, and they went to rescue the Spaniards. But in the process of doing so, the Spaniards perceived that kind of help as if uh, those people were too naive. And they served as ground to dispose, dilapidate, enslave, and almost get to the point where the whole population would be exterminated by the Spaniards. So to say he stumbled over the Bahamas on October 12th, 1492. Hence the reason those of you who are in this part of the world are tend to see a celebration um, to revere Christopher Columbus' presence in the Americas, although he never set foot on the soil of the United States. But that's a different story. But he came over Bahamas, he saw land there, so he felt, oh, okay, so that was it, and that's when he received the help. Guadahani was next, and he renamed it San Salvador. He also renamed the location where he established a small settlement, which was La Navidad. Then Mall Saint Nicolas. Now we need to take into account the name Saint Nicolas or Saint Nicholas. This is an individual who we now celebrate on behalf of Santa Claus or Christmas. Again, that's a different story too. And another settlement farther down the same coast, which he named, that was a settlement that he put together, and then he called it Santo Domingo. Now, Domingo was an individual also around the 12th to I would say around the 12th century or 12th to 13th century, used to preside over what we call orthodoxy. It's an act of faith in which individuals who were forced to convert to Christianity, they were given about 30 to 45 days to convert. And if within that time frame they did not convert, then they would he would preside over those activities where they would boil lead and pour them into those people's throat as an example for those who would be reticent to convert. All right. So when he was returning to Spain, he took along with him a few natives as possessions, and he offered them as gifts, as living toys to many members of the Catholic Church. Now, we also have the priest Bartolome de las Casas. Perhaps have heard of the name before, but Bartolome de las Casas also traveled at some point with them. and he witnessed the criminal treatment the natives were subjected to, and he could not even take it. However, knowing that Christopher Columbus had already traveled throughout the West Coast when he was with the Portuguese for, I believe it was between 1482 to 1492. So then he suggested to Columbus, to Christopher Columbus instead, to seek Africans for the kind of slave-like labor that he deemed um, those people would be more suitable for that kind of work as opposed to the natives. Now, he he went ahead and traveled to the coast back to the west coast of Africa, and this is where a whole lot of our ancestors also initially from the Spaniards went to Santo Domingo. Now, um, we need to I probably have spoken about this uh, in a in a slide coming up when we reach the Santo Domingo name, but we'll get back to that. But so we can continue. As you could see up here, this is an example of a sugar mill and plantation, and that used to be what they used at the time when we were being enslaved. My ancestors, at least, were being enslaved on plantations and those types of uh, um, um, grounds where they used to work to death. Now, he introduced the cultivation of sugarcane on the island on his second trip to in 1493. Now, be aware in Italy, Sicily, which is not far from the Mediterranean and the northern coast of Africa, they already had that kind of plantations, those types of plantations, or of that crop, meaning the sugar cane. Now, the first sugar mill was established in what he called Hispaniola because he thought it's as if they were reserving this for the king and the queen of Spain. So that island, because of its beauty, he called it Hispaniola or Santo Domingo. So to go back to the sugar mill um, that was first established in Hispaniola, it was by Gonzalo de Mendoza, and that year was 1516. After he exhausted the little bit of gold that the inhabitants were rightfully using, he went down further north to in search of resources, in search of other gold and other mines and those types of resources. And then he went down to Mexico in 1519, then Peru in 1526. Now, bear in mind again, these are some of the places that were renamed. So all of these things happened for Peru. It was in 1526, and he was still looking for more treasures. Now, the natives experienced the level of cruelty by the Spaniards that one can only parallel to those inhuman treatments inflicted upon the enslaved Africans for the same type of labor. So, settlements were erected to cultivate mainly sugarcane, but there were other crops as well. But sugarcane was the one that's more likely associated to the kind of backbreaking labor that a great many of our ancestors were subjected to. Now, this is Santo Domingo. If you look down at the bottom, you will see boats or ships down at the bottom. So it was near the coast when he first arrived, when he ended up there. So Santo Domingo, where it is located right now, was not always where it is in terms of the actual uh, um, the name of the capital. So that settlement was destroyed because of where it was located off the coast. So that made them move farther inland while maintaining the same name. So they didn't change the name; they just moved that so-called settlement in a little bit more in length, so that if something like that were to happen, so they would not be subjected to the same kind of destructions they experienced during that hurricane. Now, the importation of Africans, as suggested by the priest Las Casas, to succeed the natives as their decimation was pretty much a fait accompli. It still did not change anything in their destructive approach adopted by the Spaniards. The name again, we named don't change as they ravaged through and seized more land to the point that the whole island came to be known as Santo Domingo. What I mean by the whole island, meaning what we now call Haiti and the other part that we call the Dominican Republic. The whole thing was Santo Domingo. Meanwhile, other European nations such as France embarked in a similar criminal endeavor and had the same kind of attitude as far as taking land and appropriate lands and calling them theirs. And see, in so doing, they ended up with the western part of the island. Under the French, there again, the name remained unchanged. It was simply translated from Spanish to French, where it's called Saint Domingue as opposed to Santo Domingo. So they even tried to rename it. They understood they were just breaking the cake, but it was the same cake. Now here's a portion of what at that time was to the French. The portion that says Saint Domingue, as you can see on the map here, you will see the portion that's a bit more yellowish is the part that was called Saint Domingue at that time. So as many Frenchmen massed around the nearby island on the side of Haiti nowadays, which is called La Tortue, they positioned themselves to capitalize on the fully loaded ships of the Spaniards by attacking them, and they were pretty much stealing from the stolen goods that the Spaniards themselves had taken away from the natives. So as they grew in numbers, again on the western part, um, no far from the northern part of what we now call the western part of Haiti, of the island, they came and they stayed there and they built in numbers. So they eventually became the so-called owners of the western part. As a result of that, they had treaties signed between the two invaded nations, acknowledging ownership that France was king on the said side, and conveniently borrowed the translated version of Santo Domingo into Saint Domingue, just like we mentioned earlier. So that joint control caused both invaders to every now and then find themselves in a clash where they were fighting over resources. So they used treaties to a temporary and frail halt of their battles, and we are about to see that. Now, this is what we know to be the Massacre River. It didn't come out just like that. This river was not always like this, the way it's presented to you right now. There are different pictures of it, but finding one that resembles the past when it became to be known as the Massacre River, it was not always so. The name might have been lost based upon the fact that it's only been reported to us from their point of view. So the natives themselves did not leave a name for us that we can associate it to. So there was a battle that took place between the two invading nations, and that happened in 1691. From that battle, it served as the basis for not only the Treaty of 1697, but also as the demarcation between the two invading forces. This was as a result of that battle, initially in 1691, that gave the name, that earned the name Massacre River. Now, in 1697, there was a demarcation that took place that was officially between the two countries. Okay, the western part is mine, the that other side is yours. So then, so be it. Now, there's also in 1777, before Spain conceded the Santo Domingo portion of the French in 1795, because in 1795, a few years later after that delineation that took place in 1777, that said, okay, now this is the official border as per what they decided. But after a few battles in 1795, French, the Spaniards did not just cede the eastern part of the island to the French. They also let go of what we know as Louisiana, which is a huge portion at that time to the French. That was not the only part that they ceded to Spain. So I mean to the French. So that also was part of it. But anyway, that's a different story as far as what came to be known as New Orleans and all of those places down there. Louisiana was not just a state; it was just pretty much a good portion of what the United States. It was almost close to half of what the United States used to be. So it was not just a state; it was just almost the western part of the United States at that time. Um, so that being said, also, Spain was no match to other invading nations at that time anyway, and it was amassing as many resources and as much wealth as it could. And in so doing, and looking at what Spain has done over the years, back during slavery time and other types of invasions and decimations of other groups, you would have thought by now Spain would have the most wealth in our in this world, but it didn't happen to be so because most of the wealth and the treasures that they used to accumulate, collect, that helped to pay debt they owed to another enslaving European nation. And in that case, we can say they owed the English a whole lot of money. They borrowed a lot, and so they had to pay back a whole lot. So it's as if they were taking it from one hand and paid back through another hand. So they used to capitulate very easily and left for other easier pastures throughout South America. This is they ended up going to Mexico. They ended up going, well, Mexico was much a little bit earlier, but they later went to places such as Chile, which had a whole lot of silver, and other South American nations in which they were able to um, take away as much as they could. So that was a way for them to avoid warlike challenges. They were much more easier to cede some of the stolen properties to other stronger um, people who who wanted to also take away other people's resources. Now, there's a distorted view or distorted shared history about France about Haiti, about the Dominican Republic, but we'll have to, some of these things will help clarify a whole lot of these distorted history. France came to own the whole island of what we know now, of what came to be known as Saint Domingue. From 1795, that treaty where Spain ceded the portion of what we now call the DR to the French in 1795. So that rendered null any previous demarcations and treaties delineating through landmarks their so-called ownership. No other treaty took place acknowledging that Spain continued to own any part of the island. That is so true to the point where when in 1801, the great Toussaint Louverture became the island's general governor. This was for the entire island. There was not a portion in which you would say that part was still controlled by the Spaniards or by Spain. There was no such thing. Even his constitution then included the whole island and other immediate surrounding smaller islands, such as Samana. You had all of those little small islands surrounding that big island that we used to call Saint Domingue and Santo Domingo, what they used to call that. Okay, now we are getting to the point where we know Haiti never occupied the DR. Following the Revolution of 1791 and the capitulation of the French during the war at Vertières on November 18th, 1803. Now, following that war in 1791, the revolution, not a war, the revolution that really acknowledged people as people, where slavery was supposed to end. All that, all that time, 4 years later, in 1795, when was the Spain ceded that portion to the French. Again, as I cited earlier, when Toussaint Louverture became the general governor in 1801, the whole island was still under the French control based upon the Treaty of 1795. And we'll also see the Haitian constitutions of from 1805 all the way down to 1843. They all acknowledged the country to enclose and extend to the corners of Samana and other nearby islands, including Lanavas, which was well taken away from Haiti under the pretext that they reserved the right to claim ownership over any uninhabited island in the Caribbean and also elsewhere in the 1850s. That's another story that we probably will have a different presentation on. Now, the country called the Dominican Republic, let it be known, only came into existence especially after a major earthquake that hit the island on May 7th, 1842. Now, factions that needed to secede from the central governing body established in the western part of the island, because all of those activities, politically and economically, were central into the what we call now the northern part of Haiti, for what we call the island of Haiti now. I mean, the portion of the island of Haiti. Um, Once it gains its independence on the 27th of February 1844, when DR gained its independence after seceding from Haiti. Then they became an island, and be aware that Haiti was really weak. They were suffering under economic measures that France had imposed on them. That was under Charles X or Charles X. That was in 1825. When that happened, we were obligated to paying France uh, um, 150 million francs gold, and then a few years later they lowered it to 90 million. Now be aware, in order for Haiti to have been able to pay that, they had to also borrow from banks at 30%. So it was kind of a double debt that Haiti was compelled to paying for supposed damages lost, subjects and objects lost by those people who were killing and benefiting for free the services and all sorts of wrongdoing that were being done to those people. And yet, France found a way to impose a debt on behalf of those people who were recipients of the benefits they were collecting on their backs. But anyway, so when um, the DR became an independent country, and I believe his name was Pedro Santana, in 1844. They, in fact, wanted to call their side of the country Spanish Haiti. It was only later that it became the Dominican Republic. It wasn't always so. Now, when the DR became independent, They initiated the request on the Great Colombia, and at that time we had the Great Colombia, such as I believe it was Bolivia, Venezuela, Peru, um, um, Colombia, um, I don't know if I said Bolivia before, but those five were the Great Colombia at that time. So they wanted to be a part of it, but they were at the same time requesting that they became at some point later they wanted to become a territory also of the United States. But it was not just them willing only, but there was a mutual will for that to happen. But for many reasons, because of their um, heritage, African heritage, which is not something that a great many of them would not welcome for many reasons. That's understandable, but many of them would not. They wanted to become a U.S. territory, but that too was rejected. Now, when Pedro Santana, who was, like I said, the first president, he in 1861 asked Spain to come back and annex them as part of Spain. So Spain, the Spaniards, which still needed expansion, so they came, but they only lasted for 4 years. Now, when they came in, they weren't welcome so much to the point where people would not fight against their presence on their soil. A lot of people embarked on a fight to get rid of them, and Haiti supplied the appropriate support to the groups that were fighting against the occupier, and they came out victorious. So now we're talking about those two people acknowledge, in fact, they were two different countries. So they lived peacefully on the shared island, but understood that it was indeed two different countries. They knew that. Until the massacre, they all knew that was it's as if it was pretty much they understood it was two countries, but at the same time they had no issues among themselves. In fact, you have many Haitians, not, individuals of Haitian descent who became president of the DR from the beginning, including the individual about whom we are about to introduce very soon. So there was not a country called the DR prior to 1844. That being said, Haiti never occupied any country. It did not have the motives nor the resources for that endeavor. When besought, Haiti supplied the necessary military and other support other groups in search of their freedom, sovereignty, and dignity as a people. Cuba and many South American countries were the lucky recipients and beneficiaries in that endeavor. Now, it needs to be noted again that Haiti never occupied the DR. There was not a country called the DR until 1844. Although Haiti was not quite satisfied with the fact that the DR seceded. So the last attempt that we had in record was when President Suluk, Faustin Suluk, made an attempt, was about to make an attempt, did not arrive there, was about to make an attempt, but I believe it was about 1852 or 1557. I'll get back to that. And that was not successful at that time. So that being said, there was never a case where Haiti occupied the DR. Now, there was the invasion of Haiti by the US. When Haiti made it into the League of Independent Nations on January 1st, 1804, although you could advocate for the fact that Haiti became independent following, well, you would say became pretty much independent when the last um, troop of the French lost the battle on November 18th. From that point on, Haiti could have declared independence because they weren't forced enough there to that would have stopped that. But arrangements um and other stuff that needed to do, so finally they declared Haiti as an independent country in 1804. So there were no welcoming members in the League of Nations for Haiti. Racism as a non-scientific notion then was the order of the day, which was hate. You'll remark that I put racism there in brackets because there's no such thing really as race. It's just people fighting for trying to impose their notion of who's who and who's not. Therefore, help them keep their resources to themselves and dismiss others. But that's a different story. We could go days on this. Anyway, um, so because they were of African descent, so people would not acknowledge them as a sovereign nation at all. The newly found country, grounded on principles to live with dignity and to pursue happiness, among others. They experienced economic barriers that prevented it from living to its full potential. The country, foreign debt, and other financial obligations could not be satisfied. As I mentioned before, no other countries would wanted to deal with us. They stayed away from us. So for many reasons, then almost all institutions throughout the country they failed. Political turmoil took center stage throughout successive administrations. Now, the U.S. deemed that they were obligated to intervene on the basis that living this level of political degradation could cause instability in the region. So they justified their invasion in July of 1915, although the U.S. did come to Haiti at that time and seized gold that was in the central bank of Haiti and took them from a warship, and then they took them in 1914, December 1914, walked away with them and came to New York and deposited them at a bank, which I'm not citing in this. Now, this is just to give you a tiny picture of the invasion in 1915. At that time, we're talking about hate was at its peak in the U.S. Slavery was recent, the Jim Crow laws. Now, for your information, Jim Crow was not a person per se. It was just uh, this individual, who I think his name was Daddy. Daddy was a nickname, but I think his name was Rice. Who claimed to have seen an enslaved individual or kind of an elderly type of enslaved person who was performing what he called Jim Crow and making sounds and stuff like that. So he picked up on that and used it to degrade um, um, people of African descent in terms of um, deriding them and dressing like them and um, 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 putting things on his lips, making them big and stuff like that. And at that time, it was the way to go, and people went about that. So we're talking about around 1830s, before many years before the so-called Jim Crow laws came to be effective in terms of discrimination and all sorts of policies that diminishes the value of an individual, of a person of African descent. So injustices at that time were rampant. That was the norm. So the soldiers who were active in various wars throughout Asia, and those from the southern side of the country were the ones sent to Haiti. So not only you took people who were from the southern part of the United States at that time, where racism was the norm, was the way to go, and all of these things. These those were the people who were sent to Haiti. Those who participated in Asia in terms of wars in Asia, in acquiring places such as the Philippines, because as you probably already know, the Philippines used to be supposedly for Spain, hence the name Filipino. That was the name of the king at that time, or king or prince at that time, that they give the name to Philippines. Hence the name Filipinos that you usually get to hear from people who are from there. So those were the kinds of people who could not stand people who looked different from them. In fact, the first time Haitians saw airplanes, or let's put it as in the case of warplanes, so close was when they were being bombarded by them. Initially, many even thought that those were some giant birds of apocalypse nature. In the name of hate, the invaders committed horrendous crimes against a population of African descent. The policies they enacted and the politicians whom they picked govern the country were an expression of their hate against citizens of African heritage. And the rationale behind that could be justified through picking individuals who were more light skinned and those um, um, who had European heritage, you could easily tell. And that even explains the difference between what people could see in the way the occupiers action on the other side of the island went. That's a minor picture of the invasion of the DR by the US in 1916. So a few months after they invaded Haiti, they went to the DR as well, because they needed to justify many things, what they call political instability and economic instability, and all of these rationales to validate their presence on those lands. Now, they use the same reasons as political instability for Haiti's invasion. So the U.S. invaded a year later in 1916, although the U.S. was in control of the U.S. customs since 1907. They took over. Just as in Haiti, rebel forces, though, were not successful in their attempts and push against the oppressor and invader. They shared information as they were fighting for a common cause, their sovereignty. So they put themselves together and fought against those folks who were on their land. So there too, the U.S. regarded the DR population initially as having the same ratio in terms of um, African background, but they considered them as being closer to whiteness, though later on. Works of development were implemented differently. The army in the DR was better structured, both in numbers and ammunition, unlike the one that we had that was erected in Haiti. That one was functioning more so as a police, as using the same reasons of political instability for Haiti's invasion. The U.S. invaded the DR a year later. I believe I wanted to emphasize that a little bit more. So it was within a few months, up to let's say within a year. Um, yeah, within a year, a little bit more, in 1916, that the U.S. invaded somewhat invaded the DR, meaning somewhat because they had already taken um, hostage their customs and financial affairs around 1907. So, um, uh, as I was saying, the deal was better structured in terms of the army, both in numbers and ammunition. Unlike the one erected in Haiti, which was rather functioning as a police force, they did not have any valid interest in protecting Haiti's sovereignty. And that was understandable because there was no incentive as far as putting them in that situation to prevent further um, invasions from any other nations for that matter. So that component was not part of their training, understandably so, because there were about 2,500 to different reports. We can average it between 2,500 to 5,000 soldiers in the Haitian army, and whereas in the DR there were over 30,000 at that time. And although when you're looking at those two populations, Haiti was much more populated than the DR, and it could still be, I believe. This is only a representation of what when those two countries were living side by side, not having a so-called border that citizens living alongside that border would acknowledge as if that's their limitations and that they could not deal with each other as if they weren't one nation. Many individuals who are in the DR are perceived to be Dominicans or have a great deal to do in their backgrounds with being Haitians. Now, the border issue. In 1926, during what I put in quotation marks there, occupation, the invaders dispossessed Haitian citizens around the border of their parcels of land, and that forced them to seek employment in the DR, and especially in the sugarcane industry, because that was an industry that was mostly owned by that was mostly American owned the sugar industry. So manual labor used to come from before then. Well, alongside those people, you also had manual labor that used to come from the French, English, or well, not or in Holland, Antillean sources. Well, it's we don't have much of a choice other than calling them French, English, and Holland, Antillean, those who own those places in the Caribbean. So they used to come and work there. But it turned out to be cheaper and easier to recruit um, people who were nearby from the border, from Haiti. So in addition to that, Cuba had also repatriated many Haitians who used to work in the sugarcane industry. Haiti's economy was at the hands of the occupier and could not create sufficient jobs for its citizens. So they ended up fighting employments around the border to help sustain their families and live with dignity despite the backbreaking and low paying jobs they were working. They formed families with their neighbors. They had children. They spoke both Creole and Spanish. They were living virtually in a borderless community. You could not really tell because a lot of them did the same types of jobs. They embarked into activities that were you could that could be seamless between the two countries. It did not make much of a difference in the way they were living. So now came this dictator by the name of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. So he became to be the monster in chief who will cause so much pain on both Dominicans and Haitians as well. Now, Trujillo used to work as a security guard even during the occupation. But even before then, he also used to work on those plantations, but not as somebody who was cutting the canes or the sugar canes. It was not his position. However, he did have some uh, um, relationships with many of the Haitians who used to work there. So he knew a lot of them. He probably studied his dislike for people of African descent or Haitian descent from that point on. Um, so he transitioned from a security guard position to training into the Guardia Nacional, and following the departure of the Marines, he ascended to the highest rank as general. Now, as a former U.S. Marine trained member of the new army, he became a violent dictator for the DR, starting in 1930. In fact, he used to be in very bad activities um, before he got he became a so-called big shot in the army to the point where he would become the president or the dictator. So he was once acquitted of rape charges by a commission of Marines. Now, be aware the reason he was acquitted for it, it was pretty much known when you had power. A lot of these things happen when you have power. Invading armies do these things as if it was the norm. It was rampant. So for someone whom they wanted to maintain, to keep around them, he it was worth the while of letting him go. So they acquitted him of rape charges by a commission of Marines. So the kinds of activities he used to engage in during his early years. So he was accustomed to these things. Trujillo was of Haitian descent. A lot of people perhaps would not even understand how you could reconcile some of his hatred for people of African descent, especially people from Haiti. You would never think that his maternal grandmother was Haitian, and he had experience working, like I mentioned before earlier, in the sugarcane industry. He renamed, in fact, when he became the dictator, he renamed an entire city on his behalf. Although he was kind of unpopular throughout the country, but in order for him to find ground to make sense of his rule, of his ways of leading the country or governing the country. So he needed to bring some of those people under his control. So he was not liked by most of those people. He was not highly educated. The peasant did not find in him anybody with whom they could reconcile any part of their characters or their culture, or not much they could see in him. But he adopted policies that he anticipated would help him gain their trust. He integrated the elite intellectuals into his government that encouraged, promoted, and validated his hatred against Haitians. And they too wanted to make sure that part was done. And if he were willing to go along with that, with the plan of killing Haitians, getting rid of them. So then that would be the way to go. Then they would embark on whatever he would want to do. In fact, he was not there to just kill Haitians. He um he also was getting rid of Haitian Dominicans as well. So um, the many of the intellectuals in his government blamed DR's lack of progress on its Haitianization. Thus, the much needed approval and support he sought came to fruition when he carried out a plan he had for about a year. We see that while that's considered to be about a year, that of the genocide of the Haitians and the Haitian Dominicans, we call that Haitians and Haitian Dominicans because it was, in fact, those two people who they were living on the border side, and some of them were living inside the DR, and because of their color and all of these things, and they were not so much involved with the central government that much. So as a result of that, they were living in a community as if that was life until this individual came about. In fact, on a visit to the nearby border in city of Dahabon on October 2nd, 1932, he informed his audience that I have seen, investigated, and inquired about the needs of the population of the Dominicans who were complaining of the depredations by Haitians living among them, thefts of cattle, provisions, faith, etc., and were thus prevented from enjoying in peace the products of their labor. I have responded, I will fix this. And we have already begun to remedy the situation. 300 Haitians are now dead in Banica. This remedy will continue. Banica is the name of a different town. Now, that took place in 1935. You will see Trujillo there with his hat in his hand, and in the middle, you'll see the president of Haiti at that time, President Vincent in Haiti. That was in 1935. Now, That meeting took place in 1935 between Vincent and Trujillo in conformity with the border delineating the two countries. Following that agreement, Trujillo started putting in putting in an application his genocidal plan of eliminating Haitians and Haitian Dominicans from his country. Now, there are many speculations behind the massacre. Some call it was the Massacre, where a whole lot of people had a hard time spelling the word parsley in Spanish. There could have been that component to the genocide, but it was not the sole basis of it. It was deeper than that. It was just a tiny uh, um, rationale to justify his hatred for individuals of African descent, or more so Haitians. So the Dominicanization or wiping of the DR was something that he needed to also make sure he got done. And in so doing, Haitians needed to be out of the way. So um and what he also wanted to do was to place Haitians in such a context that they could also be regarded as individuals who came to work in on the plantations. Haitians could not be beyond those plantations. There are so many other uh, um, tricks and other things that he implemented to keep Haitians within those plantations. And the reason some of the Haitians that were not perishing this, it was because he did not have access to many of those plantations because they were American owned plantations. And that could be an entire different story as well. It's a whole lot in there. But to arrive at the genocide itself, he planned the massacre in such a way that it would not appear as if he was directly or indirectly involved in the genocidal endeavor. Um, so, um, from a variety of reports, the number of Haitians and Haitian Dominicans who perished could be up to 30,000. So we have different reports. Some of them state that it could have been 12,000, it could have been 15, it could have been 20, 25, 30,000. So different reports, but we could be up to 30,000 at that point. And most were hacked to death with machetes and other devices just to pretty much get rid of the physical person. And those who had attempted to flee were shot to death on spot. So the machete scheme was to give the crime against humanity uh, uh, a taste of, to give it an allure of domestic revolt against Haitian thieves. So it's as if the people who were massacring or killing, committing those acts of genocide on those people of Haitian descent or people of African descent, they were supposed to look as if, oh, those people, they're stealing our lands. They are there to derail our culture. They could not stand their culture. They could not stand the fact that they were there to steal everything that they grew on their land, from their garden and everything. And then so to give that crime that aspect. So he made the option of hacking Haitians to death. Now again, given so many people in about a week or so, although it took place throughout the whole country, not just within the border, it took place throughout the country. Now, if you were to take the lines of Haitians, you would have individuals, you would have the Haitians and Haitian Dominicans that you would have to um, put in line to decide whether those people were not able to um, eloquently spell the word, not spell, but pronounce the word parsley in Spanish, then it would take a good while, that long line. So it was not just that. It was much more, as I said earlier, it was much more than just finding out who could not, because it would not make much sense for anyone to look at it as if it was simply that, because those people were fluent in both Creole and Spanish, and some of them were not even fluent in Creole because they some people could just have a look of Haitian and that sufficed, and that was enough for that individual to lose his or her life. Babies were not, kids were not spared. Um, Elderly people were not spared. So it was an all-out genocidal activity that took place then. So that was what you would say it was an ugly history. The genocide extended beyond the border of the two countries. Haitians and Haitian Dominicans were executed simply for being perceived as being Haitians throughout the country. Um, but we must take into account. We must state, however, that it was not initially like that, where his policies were not always approved of by local officials. A lot of them actually rejected many of the policies that he wanted to have vis-a-vis Haitians and Haitian Dominicans. They weren't cooperating with that at all until finally they could not keep up anymore, so they capitulated. Um, and also, there were many Dominicans that protected Haitians and Haitian Dominicans. And of course, in the community where people knew each other, that was the most human thing that would be expected, and it did take place. And these things happened all the time. Even I have that recollection of a mother in the DR where a child had lost his mother, and because she also was feeding her own baby, breastfeeding her own baby, she also breastfed that Haitian child. So when humanity gets a chance to do human things under love and many other good reasons, they will put that on display as well. So those who had a chance to escape went to nearby towns on the side of Haiti. So following that 1926 dispossession of parcels of land from Haitians around the border, they were compelled. Now, when we said dispossessions of those in 1926, they were by the occupier at that time, although they had already left the DR. But in 1926, because the invader was still on the side of Haiti, because they had already left the DR in 1924, September 1924. But they were still in Haiti up until 1934. So 1926 was just right in the middle of the occupation. So they were compelled to seek employment in the sugarcane industry. So, mentioned earlier, Cuba's economy was slowing down and had to send Haitians back home. They too were working in the sugar plantation back there. So that was pretty much the same kind of activity when you know this is what you do, so then you seek employment in the same area. That's the nature of the human. That's how people do work. Now, this is the individual who was president of Haiti then. His name is Stimio Vincent. He was the president of Haiti at the time these things were happening. So when words of the genocide reached Haiti, um, Stimio Vincent, the President Vincent, and with whom somewhat less than 2 years prior to the massacre, recalled that they met in 1935 to decide on the border situation. So um, when he faced that genocide, he was not equipped to protect his fellow citizens. He was not. He sought the help of the U.S., who was somewhat still an ally of the Trujillo in the Caribbean. Um, Now, before I get to seeking the help through Mexico, through the U.S., Mexico, and Cuba, we need to state that um, the U.S. Had decided Roosevelt at that time, although he was a captain during the invasion of Haiti, he was in Haiti at that time. He was even the one who changed who helped change the constitution in Haiti, that opposed that a foreign citizen could not own land in Haiti. So he changed that around 1918, 1919. He changed the whole thing. So he had developed what they had called the good neighbor policy. So as a result of that, he found ground to not intervene when Haiti appealed to the U.S., Mexico, and Cuba, and also later on to other international institutions as mediators. So the U.S. said, "No, I'm not part of it. I have no business dealing with this. You find your way out of this." Now, when the U.S. declined to get involved and to take any role, so Vincent appealed to the Gondra Treaty. The Gondra Treaty, which carries the name of, I believe his name was Manuel Gondra. When that was when Paraguay um, and Bolivia had a situation where they were fighting against each other. So the Gondra Treaty sought to um, appease any kind of um, misunderstanding, any kind of um, it would say war, for that not to happen in the southern part of this in South America, and other countries that also wanted to be part of it. So that was just a treaty to prevent any further aggression from any one of those countries towards each other. Now, you also have the Inter American Convention of Conciliation and Arbitration, of which Haiti was a member. So that too had to do with a whole lot of those countries in order for them to see in what way they could seek some compensation or some investigation arriving from those institutions. Now, some other key players in this process, and that must be noted, other associations and African American activists within the US, they made attempts as well to seek an investigation into the massacre, but um, it was it was mostly the African American activists here in the U.S. that made so many attempts as seeking. They wanted to see through this. They wanted to see what truly happened, and they know about what happened, but they wanted to put that on display, make U.S. look and take his real position on the international stage for them to see that the U.S. refused to take a position in this as far as helping with the investigation. Um, Even President Roosevelt's son at some point went down to visit Trujillo for a few days. But anyway, no investigation never took place. Um, and eventually there were 750 there was an indemnity to pay $750,000, which Trujillo admitted, okay, consented to pay, okay, we'll pay this much. No investigation ever took place. No one was ever convicted. The bodies were burned and could not be traced. Out of the $750,000 that was supposed an indemnity for to pay to Haiti, only $250,000 were ever paid to the Haitian government, and the DR or Trujillo never cared to pay the remaining balance, and the amount paid amounted to an average of $10 to $17, depending upon how many people got killed. Unfortunately, the parents of the victims did not see much in this meager payout. It was indeed a very sad story. It was not just a parsley massacre, it was deeper than that. It was hate at play to the highest level. Now, initially, this presentation was supposed to go to uh, a school. Hence, the reason you see the generations that we in, and that's also a good rationale to use, a good reason to remind people about their kids, or if there are kids listening to this at this moment, to be aware that the generations that committed those horrendous acts, they too at some point were kids. And kids are pretty much good until they receive influences from adults or older kids whom they may regard as heroes and whose actions they may seek to emulate one day. At times, kids carry certain habits through their adulthood and develop identities that get reinforced through their environments. The society or the adults they interact with, they become agents to others' programs and agendas without ever realizing they are on the wrong path and that they get to cause tremendous damage to individuals, groups, and different countries. This way, then, hate finds a way to filter through their mind, and it may all seem normal after a while. But you, as kids who are called upon to be the next leaders of your generation, you have the ultimate obligation to be agents of positive change and make the world a more suitable place for all human beings. Develop ambitious goals that will help you contribute to making society a better living community for everyone. Again, I am the author and narrator. My name is Claude Bernard, and I thank the following people for their great input and support. My wife, Dominique Bernard, for her support and suggestions. Jean Demore for his recommendation. It was upon his recommendation that the history professor, teacher at that school, wanted to hear my side or of the story that truly happened um, in Haiti and the DR. Jerry Giles, I thank him for his expertise and considerable input, and Martine Dozabo for her support. I thank you, all of you, for your immense support. And these are the references that, through my research, that allowed me to have the input that you have just listened to. Thank you.